There are several new features in data deduplication on the Windows Server 2016 OS. One of those is larger volumes. Prior to Server 2016, so in Server 2012 R2, the max volume size Microsoft recommended to dedupe was a 10 terabyte volume. Now in Server 2016, that number goes up to a 64 terabyte volume. Coincidentally, 64 terabytes is also the maximum size of a virtual hard drive in Microsoft. If you were to create a VHDX for storage purposes, storage pools or anything like that, a single VHDX would have a max size of 64 terabytes. We also have support for larger files. Prior to Server 2016, a 1 terabyte file was the max recommended file size. Now, when I say recommended, I say that because that's what Microsoft says. You could attempt to dedupe a larger volume or larger file size, but the speed at which deduplication ran, you may have never actually finished deduplicating before content started to change. It would simply take too long. The performance has actually increased in Server 2016. So now we can dedupe files in excess of 1 terabyte, and they should work efficiently. Microsoft has that fully supported. The Nano Server is a new operating system in Windows Server 2016. The Nano Server operating system is quite a bit different from the standard and data center operating systems, even very different from the Server Core OS. Nano Server is approximately 500 megabytes on disk, so it's 1/20th the size of a full operating system. Nano Server is limited in its capability, so it can't do everything a desktop OS can do, or even a Server Core. It does not have all those features. What Nano Server can do is be a file server. If I were to deploy Nano Server as a file server, I could run deduplication on that. Nano Server even supports being in a file server cluster. So, a possible scenario. I could build a 2-node file server cluster. I could host 50 terabytes of data in my 2-node file server cluster, but the operating systems could be Nano Server, consuming only 500 megs per OS in that cluster, yet they could host several terabytes of data. Well, Nano Server has full support for data deduplication. It's assumed now that if you were to build a file server cluster, that you would actually run deduplication just to conserve space and make the cluster operate more efficiently. Something that has been improved in 2016 is backup support. Now, we've long had support to backup files in a deduplicated state, but Microsoft has enhanced that. In Server 2016, when you perform a backup of a volume that's been deduplicated, the backup actually runs faster. All the files are backed up in a deduplicated state, and the chunk store is also backed up. So nothing has to be rehydrated, which is a fairly common term they use, which some older backup software had to basically go through and take all the files that had been deduplicated, and it had to rehydrate all those files, which is basically undeduplicate them. I think that's a term, which was incredibly inefficient. Now, most environments did not do that. What they did was they sought out software that could actually back up files in a deduplicated state. But now Windows Server Backup has the ability to do that, and their System Center Data Protection Manager, which is often referred to as DPM, can back all of these files up in a deduplicated state. We also have support for rolling cluster upgrades. A rolling cluster upgrade means I have a cluster that runs, we'll say 2012 R2, a 3-node cluster. Every node runs 2012 R2. Well, when I want to upgrade my cluster to Server 2016, the easiest way to do that is to add a node running Server 2016, then remove a node running 2012 R2. Add another node running 2016, remove another node running 2012 R2, then do the third and final node. Add 2016, remove 2012 R2. Now your entire cluster runs Windows Server 2016. So that's the easiest way to go through that process. A problem in the past: if you ran 2012 R2 deduplication on your file server cluster, all the nodes in the cluster had to run 2012 R2. Now in 2016, I can have a rolling cluster upgrade, meaning I can introduce a 2016 server to the cluster and I can continue to run deduplication on server 2016 and on my Windows Server 2012 R2 OSs. So it has support for that process. Long ago, the process was when you went to upgrade a cluster, you would have to turn off deduplication if it was going to be a rolling cluster upgrade all the nodes in the cluster, then turn it back on, which was just incredibly inefficient and it took a lot more planning. So those are some of the new features in Windows Server 2016.